Decimals. Decimals use place value to represent an amount. To read a decimal, like we have here, first read the number to the left as a whole number, followed by and, then read the number to the right of the decimal, followed by the last place value. So this number would be read as 641 and 5,129 10,000ths. This number could also be represented as a mixed number. 641 and 5,129 10,000ths. Let's look at another decimal. 5 and 8,139 10,000ths. We could write this number as an improper fraction by taking the 5 plus, this would be 8/10ths since it's in the tenths place, plus 1/100ths, plus 3,000ths, plus 9/10,000ths, which would give us 58,139 10,000ths. So we've seen a decimal in decimal form. We've seen it represented as a mixed number and also as an improper fraction. Fractions. A fraction is a number that is expressed as one integer written above another integer with a dividing line between them, like x divided by y. So for example, 3/4. In this fraction, 3/4, the top number is called the numerator, and the bottom number is called the denominator. The numerator is the part that's being considered, while the denominator is the whole. So in this fraction, 3/4, we could take a pie shape and cut it into 4 pieces. That's our whole. And the part that's being considered is 3/4. So 1, 2, 3. So now you can see how much of our pie we're talking about, 3/4. We can manipulate fractions, and we do this by multiplying or dividing both the numerator and the denominator by the same number, not by adding and subtracting. We manipulate fractions to do many things. One thing is to compare them. If we were to compare 3/4 and 2/3, we would first need to find what's called a common denominator. Because in order to compare them, I need them to have the same denominator. So I can tell which one's bigger or if they're equal. So we'll take 3/4 and 2/3, and we're going to find a common denominator. When you do that, you want to look for multiples of the denominators. And the least common multiple will be the least common denominator. So the multiples of 4 and 3, 4 is 4, 8, 12, 16, etc. 3 is 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, etc. So the least common multiple between 4 and 3 is 12. So that means I want to change this fraction to something over 12. Same with my other fraction. What I'm doing is creating an equivalent fraction. 3/4 is equal to something over 12. So I'm going to multiply my numerator and my denominator both by 3 to achieve that denominator of 12. So 3 times 3 is 9. And so our fraction is 9/12. And then for 2/3, we'll do a similar thing. We want to change our denominator from 3 to 12. So we multiply 3 times 4 to get 12. And we must do the same to our numerator. 2 times 4 is 8. So now we can easily see which fraction is larger. 3/4 is equivalent to or equal to 9/12. And 2/3 is equal to 8/12. Well, 9 out of 12 is definitely more than 8 out of 12. So we could say that this fraction 3/4 is bigger than this fraction 2/3 if we were to compare them. So let's talk a little bit more about equivalent fractions. All of these fractions are equivalent fractions because they all represent the same value. 2/10, 3/15, 4/20, 5/25. And we could see that they represent the same value more easily by simplifying our fractions. So we said we can manipulate fractions by multiplying the numerator and denominator by the same value, or we can manipulate them by dividing the numerator and denominator by the same value. So if we wanted to simplify this fraction 2/10, we would just divide the numerator and the denominator by the same value. Both 2 and 10 are divisible by 2. So we divide our numerator by 2 and our denominator by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 10 divided by 2 is 5. We do the same thing to our next fraction. 3 and 15 are both divisible by 3. So we divide our numerator by 3 and our denominator by 3. 3 divided by 3 is 1. 15 divided by 3 is 5. 4/20. Our numerator and denominator are both divisible by 4. So divide by 4, divide by 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1. And 20 divided by 4 is 5. Finally, 5/25. Numerator and denominator are both divisible by 5. 5 divided by 5 is 1. And 25 divided by 5 is 5. So as you can see, all 4 of these fractions are equal to 1/5. 1/5 is the simplest form of these fractions, and they are all equivalent fractions since they all have the same value, 1/5. Ratios. A ratio is a comparison between two quantities. You can think of a ratio like a fraction, and since it's just like a fraction, a comparison of two numbers, it is treated a lot like a fraction, meaning you're going to simplify it anytime you can. Let's look at this problem. Suppose a sampling of fish from a local pond contains 12 bass, 8 catfish, 38 minnows, and 4 trout. What is the ratio, so the comparison of two numbers, of bass to minnows? Now, when they ask you this question, they're telling you exactly how to set your ratio up. Since it says bass to minnows, we read left to right. We also read from top to bottom. Since a ratio is a fraction, then they're telling you what your numerator should be and what your denominator should be. So our ratio is going to be bass to minnows. And now we can substitute how many bass and minnows we have. According to our problem, we have 12 bass and we have 38 minnows. So that ratio would be 12 to 38. But again, since this is a fraction, we're going to simplify it if we can. And 12 and 38 do have a GCF of 2, so we're going to divide 12 by 2 to get 6, and we'll divide 38 by 2 to get 19. Therefore, our ratio of bass to minnows is 6 to 19. But that's not the only way we can write a ratio. We could also write it as 6 to 19, or as 6 to 19. And these all mean the same thing, and they all give you the same information, that for every 6 bass in the pond, there are 19 minnows in your pond. It is important, though, the order of your numbers. Since the ratio they were asking for was bass to minnows, your bass number should be first, and then your minnows number. So make sure you put it in the right order. That is very important. Multiples. You can think of multiples as like counting by that number. So for instance, the multiples of 2 would be 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, etc. The multiples of 3 would be 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, etc. The multiples of 4 would be 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, and so on. Sometimes you're asked to find the LCM of 2 or more numbers. The LCM is the least common multiple. Least meaning the smallest, common meaning the same, and multiple. So if we wanted to find the LCM of, let's say, 2 and 3, the least common multiple of 2 and 3, so the smallest number that 2 and 3 have in common, would be 6. So that's the LCM of 2 and 3. The LCM of, say, 3 and 4, the very smallest number that they have in common would be 12. And you can find the least common multiple of bigger numbers, like say the least common multiple of 12 and 15. So 12 would be 12, 24, 36, 48, 60, 72, etc. While 15 would be 15, 30, 45, 60, So if we were finding the LCM of 12 and 15, the smallest number they have in common is 60. So the least common multiple is 60.
When you are evaluating a research summary, you should take special care to identify the variables in the experiment. The variables in the basic experiment can be either independent or dependent. So we'll start with independent variables. So the independent variable in an experiment is the aspect of the experiment that is changed by the scientist on purpose. And then you have the dependent variables. So the dependent variable in an experiment is the aspect that responds to changes that are made in the independent variable. So we have cause and effect here. The independent causes the dependent variable to change. And so the independent variable is manipulated by scientists on purpose so that we can see the effect of it on the dependent variable. And so while the independent variable is manipulated, the dependent variable is just observed to see the changes that take place in it. Now, it's important to be able to identify the independent and dependent variables in an experiment. So let's take a look at this example. An experiment exploring how plastic reacts to different amounts of heat. So here we're taking a look at plastic and its response to heat. So the independent variable here is going to be temperature. Because we're looking at cause and effect here, and we're looking at how plastic responds to heat. And so heat, or the temperature here, must be the independent variable, because that's what we're changing around to see how plastic responds. So that leads us to the dependent variable, which is going to be the plastic. Because we're seeing or observing how the plastic reacts to the differing amounts of heat. So again, the independent variable is the aspect of the experiment that is changed, and the dependent variable is the aspect that responds to the changes made in the independent variable. In math, we have rational numbers and we have irrational numbers. So we're going to be taking a look at rational numbers, which have 4 different categories, and those are integers, percents, fractions, and decimals. So we're going to define each of these. Even if you're already somewhat familiar with them, we're going to go ahead and define them and give some examples. So starting out with integers. Integer is a positive or negative whole number or 0. So 9 would be a whole number. It would be an integer because it's a positive whole number. Negative 6 is an integer because it's a negative whole number. Then, of course, 0 is an integer because we said it was. And so now we move on to percents, which is kind of a more complicated way to say percent is a part per 100. So an example of a percent is 20%, which we could also write as 20 parts per 100. But the important thing here is just you know what a percent is, like 20%. Then fractions, which is a proportion. So an example would be 20 divided by 10, or 2 divided by 4. And of course we have decimals, so this is where we have an integer, maybe 1, maybe 89, maybe 0. And then we have a decimal place, and then we have numbers after the decimal, like 20.53. So we have our integer, we have a decimal, and then we have numbers after the decimal. So integers, percents, fractions, and decimals are all rational numbers, usually. There are some rules. So in order to be a rational number, just summarize, it either has to be an integer, like we talked about. If it's a number like 9, negative 6, 0, it's always going to be a rational number. It gets more complicated when we come to fractions and decimals. If it's a fraction, it has to be an integer divided by an integer. And this integer cannot equal 0. So it's an integer divided by an integer. So 7 divided by 4 cuts it. That works. Now, decimals are a little bit more complicated because it either has to be a terminating decimal or a repeating decimal. So an example of a terminating decimal would be something like 2 divided by 4. From that you get 0.5. It ends right there at the 5. For a repeating decimal, you do 1 divided by 3 and you get 0.3333. It goes on forever. But notice we're getting the same number every time. So really you could erase all of these 3's and just put a line over the 3 showing it's a repeating decimal. What you don't want is a decimal like pi, where you have 3.1415926. 5359. It just keeps going on and on. So there's no ending to it, so it's not a terminating decimal, and there's no pattern to it, so it's not a repeating decimal. That's what an irrational number is, one that just keeps going like this. These numbers, they have basically a stopping point. And so that's what we're looking for. And so the reason I say that a fraction has to be an integer over an integer is because when you divide an integer by an integer, you get a clean number. You get a decimal that's repeating or terminating. When you start dividing a decimal or a fraction by a number, or a fraction by another fraction, that's when you're going to start getting messy. So really, if you're wondering whether a fraction is a rational number, what you can do is go ahead and divide it out and then look at the decimal and decide whether it's terminating, repeating, or non-ending. And that's how you can determine if it was a rational number.
Photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a process used by plants and other autotrophic organisms to convert light energy, usually from the sun, into chemical energy that can be used by the organism. Photosynthesis usually gives off oxygen as a waste product as well. Oxygen is not something that the plant or other autotrophic organism will need in most cases, and so it will give off oxygen as a waste product. Now, autotrophic means that these organisms make their own food. They are capable of creating their own food. They can harness the light energy and create their own source of nourishment. Heterotrophs cannot do that and must rely on autotrophs or other heterotrophs for their nourishment. Most plants, most algae, and cyanobacteria perform photosynthesis and are called photoautotrophs. So, autotrophs are organisms that can create their own food. Photoautotrophs are organisms that create their own food from light, since photo translates to light, looking at the Latin root for that word. These are organisms that can create their own nourishment from light. Photosynthesis maintains atmospheric oxygen levels and supplies most of the energy necessary for life on Earth. So, as these autotrophic organisms take in carbon dioxide, they let out oxygen and help maintain the atmospheric oxygen levels, because people and other organisms exhale carbon dioxide, and the plants or other autotrophs take that carbon dioxide in and turn it back into oxygen, which we breathe. So if we didn't have photosynthesis, we'd be running low on oxygen. And so photosynthesis helps maintain our oxygen levels. It also supplies most of the energy necessary for life on Earth. Even though you don't feel like you're eating light or getting your energy just from light, if you eat a vegetable, then you're eating something that it has only been able to grow because it used light energy to provide nourishment for itself. So you are now eating that plant, which got its energy and was able to grow from light. If you were to eat a cow, if you had beef, if you had a hamburger, then you would be eating another heterotroph. Cows can't make their own food, but they ate grass and other vegetables and other foods that were grown, and they were grown by having light energy harnessed inside those plants. And so the cow got the energy from the plant, which got the energy from the light, and then you were getting energy from the cow. So it all comes back to the light energy. So while there are other sources of energy, the light energy is a primary source for everything going on Earth. Photosynthesis always begins when energy from light is absorbed by proteins that contain green chlorophyll pigments. So, the autotrophs that perform photosynthesis don't always look green, but somewhere in their body, they're going to have these chlorophyll pigments that are able to take in and absorb light to start the process of photosynthesis. And photosynthesis occurs in two stages. You have your light reactions or light-dependent reactions, so these depend on light to happen. And it's when organisms capture and store the light energy. The light energy is converted to chemical energy in the form of NADPH and ATP. So in this light reaction or light-dependent reaction stage, the light energy is actually captured, turned into a chemical form of energy that can be stored or immediately used if necessary. In the
carbon dioxide fixing reactions or light independent reactions. These are ones that can happen even whenever light isn't present, as long as there was some energy harnessed in that plant already. So these don't have to happen while there is light present supplying energy. They can happen later. And this is when the formed NADPH and ATP, so it's already stored and formed in that autotroph. Those two energy molecules drive the reduction of carbon dioxide to more useful organic compounds, such as glucose. And they are also referred to as the Calvin or Calvin-Benson cycle. So when the carbon dioxide is reduced, that process can be called the Calvin or Calvin-Benson cycle as well. So even though this is a light-independent reaction, it does still depend on molecules that were created by converting light energy into a stored chemical energy. So even though we call them light independent, they really couldn't occur if you didn't have the light transferring, the light energy that was able to be transferred to these energy molecules that are stored chemically. The main thing to remember about photosynthesis is that it is the process by which autotrophs can make their own energy using light. Genes. A gene is a molecular unit of heredity of a living organism. A gene is the basic instruction, a sequence of nucleic acids. So a gene is going to be the instruction, it's going to be the sequence of nucleic acids that tells the cell to code for a certain protein or for a certain RNA chain. It isn't just one little thing, it's a sequence that gives an instruction to the cell. While an allele codes for one variant of that gene. So if you've heard someone say, oh, she has really good hair genes, or she's got the gene for blue eyes, that's not exactly true, because everyone has a gene for eye color or hair color, and for every other trait that you have. But what determines what color your hair is or what color your eyes are is going to be the alleles for that gene. So there are dominant alleles and recessive alleles. And if you have even one dominant allele, then you're going to have the dominant gene. If you have two recessive alleles, then you will have that recessive gene. For instance, if you have two parents that have brown eyes, you could still end up with blue eyes because blue is a recessive gene. So both of your parents had one dominant and one recessive brown and blue eye color allele. The brown would have been prevalent in both of them. But since they both had that recessive blue allele present, you could still end up with blue eyes because of the recessive alleles combining. And I know that all sounds a little confusing, but it's just to tell you that each gene doesn't determine something all on its own. It's the alleles that are the variants of that gene that determine what the outcome of each gene sequence is. Genes do specify all proteins and functional chains. So they specify how these are going to be created, the functional RNA chains. Genes hold the information needed to build and maintain an organism's cells and pass genetic traits to offspring. So where I was talking about two parents that could have brown eyes and still pass on the blue eye color, it's because of the alleles that they carry, whether dominant or recessive, whether you can see it as a physical trait or not. Your parents carried genetic traits and they passed those on to you. And some of your physical traits may not all be the same as one or both of your parents, but the genetic traits that you got did come from the alleles that they had combined and mixed together. So you took some of your mother's alleles and some of your father's alleles, and when those combined, you ended up with different alleles and different genetic traits of your own, but they both came from the genetic traits your parents had. Some examples are eye color, number of limbs, and blood type. So some genes you can see right away manifested, such as eye color or number of limbs. But blood type is something that you would have to do a little more scientific research to discover. You can also search for certain markers in your body for diseases such as Alzheimer's or other hereditary diseases. Those can be tested for, and your DNA will show, your genes will show if you have a likelihood of getting that disease. And so that's definitely not something you can see just by looking at someone. It's something that you would have to do more research into. But it's possible by looking at the genes in your body. Now, for a gene to create or code for its protein, it must go through transcription. And transcription is where single-stranded messenger RNA or mRNA is created that is complementary to the DNA from which it was transcribed. And we'll look at that over here in just a minute. But basically, you're starting with DNA and you're transcribing it into the messenger RNA. And then the messenger RNA is going to bring the message elsewhere in the cell. So next comes translation. That messenger RNA is used as a template for synthesizing a new protein. Transfer RNA, or tRNA, brings the amino acids and anticodon necessary for protein synthesis. And something to remember is that genes are read 3 nucleotides at a time in units called codons. So you look at the 3 nucleotides that are coding for this one protein, and they're going to be transcribed onto messenger RNA, which is going to travel elsewhere in the cell, and transfer RNA is going to bring the amino acids and the anticodon that match up with that set of 3, with that codon, and let the protein be created. So let's look at that over here. Let's pretend this gene sequence came from a strand of DNA. And remember, your bases are adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. So we are going to say it's going to change from DNA to the messenger RNA. So we're transcribing here. And each base must be transcribed. So here we've got our transcription. So the guanine is going to transcribe to cytosine, cytosine to guanine, thymine to adenine, cytosine to guanine. There we go. Thymine to adenine, and thymine to adenine. So the messenger RNA is going to carry this sequence. So you can see how it isn't exactly what was on the DNA, it's what base would have paired with the DNA. So it's kind of like a code you've got to sit here and figure out. You've got to decode what the messenger RNA says. So the messenger RNA has the pairs that would have gone with the DNA, and so in comes your transfer RNA, which is going to have its amino acids and the anticodon that's necessary for each of these. So each set of 3 is a codon, and it gets transferred over. And so now the transfer RNA is going to come in, and it's going to bring what we need. So it's going to say, okay, we had cytosine, so now we need the guanine. I guess we should really point this way. And then it's going to bring cytosine back to pair with the guanine, thymine back to pair with adenine, cytosine back to pair with guanine, thymine to pair with adenine, and thymine to pair with adenine. So now in a different part of the cell, you've got these codons, and they're gonna code for a certain protein, and this is what happens in the cell. So this part would be your translation. So you've got strands of DNA. Part of the cell says, oh, I need a certain protein. well, this codon codes for one of the proteins you need, and this codon codes for one of the other proteins you need. So the DNA is going to send it. The messenger RNA is going to hold the transcription, which is where it's changed to what the pairs would be. What pairs with each base is going to be the transcription that goes on the messenger RNA. And then the messenger RNA travels off into the cell to where the protein is needed. The transfer RNA is going to bring the bases plus amino acids. And then you're going to get these bases plus the new amino acids are going to give you your proteins that these codons were coding for. So you've got your transcription where it's coded onto the messenger RNA, and then you've got translation where it's decoded and the transfer RNA brings in what you need plus amino acids and your proteins are created. So that's kind of a complicated process, but it's what genes do. That's their job. Their job is to send messages throughout the cell so that new proteins can be created. And they are going to carry your hereditary information, and they have the basic instructions necessary to tell your body how to carry out the hereditary processes and keep producing the genes that you keep producing the cells and the proteins that you need and maintaining your cells. So just keep in mind, genes are units of hereditary information, and they carry messages throughout the cell and instruct the cell on how to create the proteins that your body needs.
We can classify cells into two categories, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. So prokaryotic cells are smaller than eukaryotic cells. In addition to being smaller, they lack membrane-bound nucleuses. So they don't have a membrane-bound nucleus. Now, they contain single-stranded circular DNA molecules that free float in, you can probably guess, they free float in cytoplasm, because cytoplasm is kind of the fluid in a cell that all the other organelles in the cell float around in. So the DNA molecules free float in cytoplasm. So some different organelles that are in prokaryotic cells are ribosomes, centrioles, often one or more flagella, and cytoskeleton elements. Then we have eukaryotic cells, and so these are going to be obviously larger than prokaryotic cells. And these contain linear, double-stranded DNA combined with histone and packaged as chromosomes. And then the chromosomes are found inside a nucleus bounded by two membranes. So notice here, the eukaryotic cells do have a membrane-bound nucleus. Now, eukaryotic cells contain a variety of other membrane-bound organelles, such as mitochondria, chloroplast, endoplasmic reticula, Golgi bodies, lysosomes, and vacuoles. Now, eukaryotic ribosomes are larger and more complex than those found in prokaryotes, which is what is another way of saying prokaryotic cells. Now, you may be wondering, where do you find prokaryotic cells and where do you find eukaryotic cells? Well, prokaryotic cells are usually in single-celled organisms, such as bacteria, whereas eukaryotic cells are what you find in more complex organisms. It's what you see the result of on a daily basis, because plants and animals are made up of eukaryotic cells. So that's a look at prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells and the differences between them. I want to take a look at 4 of the basic properties of gases. And I want to talk about the properties of gases in the context of a balloon, so that it gives us something to visualize when we're talking about these properties. So think of a balloon, and as you blow air into this balloon, you're adding molecules to the air. As more of this air gets added to the balloon, the volume is going to increase, which makes sense. Everyone knows when you blow air into a balloon, the balloon expands. And if you let air out of the balloon, then the balloon gets smaller. So volume is proportional to the amount of gas. Now, for this to be true, the temperature and the pressure has to be constant. And you may be wondering, why is that? Well, you'll see later that temperature affects the volume and the pressure affects the volume. So if the temperature and pressure are changing, then they're also affecting the volume in addition to the amount of gas, and we can no longer really see what's really affecting the volume. So volume is no longer proportional to the amount of gas. But if temperature and pressure are constant through this entire time, we can pretty much take them out of the equation because they're not affecting anything anymore because they're not changing. So when temperature and pressure are constant, we can then say volume is proportional to the amount of gas. Now, the second property of gas is also very interesting. If you think about a balloon that has a fixed amount of air in it, in other words, the end's tied off. You can't add air, you can't remove air. And then you heat this balloon, it will expand. The volume will increase. As you heat it, the balloon will get bigger. Now, if you cool the balloon, then the volume will decrease. The balloon will get smaller. So we can say the volume changes directly with temperature. As temperature increases, volume increases. And as temperature decreases, volume decreases. Now, for this to be true, the pressure of the balloon has to remain constant throughout the entire process. Now, if you squeeze the balloon, the volume will decrease because gases are compressible. So we can say the volume changes inversely with the pressure. And this makes sense. Okay, so say there's lots of pressure. You're pushing really hard on this balloon. The volume is going to decrease. So at that point, the pressure is increasing because you're pushing harder, but the volume is decreasing. And if the pressure decreases and you're not pushing as hard, then the volume will increase. So that's why we say volume changes inversely with the pressure. And for this to be true, the temperature has to remain constant. Now, the fourth and final property of a gas. If you fix the volume of the balloon and add more air, then the pressure inside will increase. So we can say pressure changes directly with the amount of gas. And this makes sense because you think about air molecules inside that balloon. They're moving all over the place. Well, if volume, or if the amount of gas is large, then the molecules are going to hit the sides very often. Okay, so you think about the volume being the same throughout this whole time. The balloon is always going to be the same size. But if you add more air to it, then there's more air molecules that are going to hit the side of the balloon more often. So that increases pressure. But if there's less air inside that balloon, then the air molecules are going to hit the sides of the balloon less often, which decreases the pressure. So that's why we say pressure changes directly with the amount of gas. Now, for this to be true, like I said, the volume has to be constant and the temperature also has to be constant. So those are the four basic properties of gases. The solar system consists of the sun and the 8 major planets that orbit around it. So first we have the sun, and then I'm going to order the 8 major planets in order of how close they are to the sun. So we start out with Mercury, then Venus, then the third from the sun is Earth. Then we have Mars. And then in between Mars and the next planet we have an asteroid belt. Then after that asteroid belt is Jupiter, then Saturn, Uranus, then Neptune. Now you may be thinking Pluto should come after Neptune. Well, Pluto is no longer considered to be a planet. Now it's considered to be, or is classified as one of the 5 known trans-Neptunian objects regarded as minor planets. So then after Neptune we have the Kuiper belt. And so this Kuiper belt extends from about 30 astronomical units from Neptune to about 50 astronomical units. So an astronomical unit is the distance from the sun to the earth, and so that's 150 million kilometers. So the Kuiper belt extends from Neptune at 30 astronomical units out to about 50 astronomical units. So that's a total of 1 light year, or 9.5 trillion kilometers from the sun. And so this contains countless numbers of icy bodies of water, methane, and ammonia, some with rocky cores. Now, beyond the Kuiper belt lies the hypothesized spherical Oort cloud, thought to be the source of long-period comets. So that's the Oort cloud. And so there's 8 major planets, so I'm going to put a check mark next to those. And again, these are in order from the distance they orbit the sun. So notice here that if you remember any kind of certain phrase to remember the order of the planets, notice that there's 2 M's. And so Mercury is the closest to the sun, and then Mars is after Earth. But all the other planets start with different letters. So the order is Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune.
Today we're going to briefly go over one simple machine, the wheel and the axle. The wheel and the axle, categorized as a simple machine, and we want to talk about mechanical advantage of the wheel and axle. Essentially, with a wheel and an axle, most people tend to think of automobile tire, because that's usually what we talk about, is a wheel and an axle. 2 wheels attached by an axle. But what we want to think about to help illustrate the point of the mechanical advantage of the wheel and axle is something more along the lines of a steering wheel. Essentially, the steering is done by the central column. But if you had to grip that central column and turn it with your hand this way, it would be almost impossible. So by attaching a wheel to that central axle and moving the radius of that circle out, it takes much less force to turn the central axle and therefore to turn the car. So what you have then is a mixture of one type of force, the wheel, attached to the axle, making it easier then to do what you would ordinarily have to exert a great deal of force if you grabbed the main axle itself and tried to turn it by itself. So I've got a picture here. This is the central axle here. This is the outer wheel of the steering wheel, if you will. If we had to grab the central column and turn it, it would be almost impossible for us to get enough force. But you move the wheel out, attach the axle, and you apply force out here, and it becomes much easier to turn here. So force here translates here to greater force. So the mechanical advantage increases with the radius. So I've got an example up here. If we've got a radius of 12 versus a radius of 10, with our axiom over here, the mechanical advantage increases with the radius. Bigger radius, 12, means greater mechanical advantage. What we mean by that is if the same amount of force was applied to the outer wheel at 10 inches and the same amount of force applied to the wheel at 12 inches, you would get a much greater advantage at the 12-inch radius than at the 10, assuming the same amount of force is applied. It becomes, it translates here to the central axle much greater. So the mechanical advantage is greater the larger the wheel is. And in the same way, if you've got a larger wheel, it takes less force to turn it. So if you think about it, sometimes in little sporty cars, they have sort of smaller steering wheels, but when you get to something as big as a bus or an 18-wheeler, they usually have very large steering wheels. And this is just an application of this simple machine, the wheel and the axle, the mechanical advantage increasing as the radius also increases. Well, this has just been a basic overview then of the simple machine, wheel and axle. If you'd like to learn more about this or related matters, underneath this video, you'll find a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to that website that has that information. And while you're on that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus was an explorer from Genoa, Italy. As an adult, Columbus worked as a trader, traveling mostly by sea. So Columbus had a lot of experience at sea. He was an experienced sailor. He had done this for many years of his life. Then he came up with an idea. After many years of presenting his idea, Columbus finally received financial backing from King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain in 1492. And this was his idea. He wanted to find a new trade route to Asia, which lay to the east. So Asia lay to the east of them, but he wanted to get there by sailing west. He thought if he started here, and went far enough this way, he'd circle back around and hit here. And he would have been right, except that America was in the way. You had two continents, North and South America, that were not going to go away. So his plan didn't work out quite like he thought it was going to. Now, he tried for several years to get people to accept this plan, but since they had just come up with the route to go south of the tip of Africa to get to Asia, people weren't as interested in it. Finally, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain said, okay, we feel like maybe there's an idea here, we'll support you and see how it goes. So Columbus was given 3 ships for his first voyage: the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And he eventually landed near South America. But he thought he had reached the Indies, which is what they called Asia at that time. So Columbus made 4 voyages in all to what he called the West Indies. So he thought by sailing west, he'd reached the Indies, and he called them the West Indies. He made 4 voyages there, and he kept thinking he was reaching the Indies. Now, other people didn't think so. They thought he was getting to different land. But Columbus refused to believe that. He held on to the belief that he had reached the West Indies as he planned to. Now, he didn't discover a new trade route to the Asian Indies. He thought he had, but he hadn't. But he did discover a new trade route. He discovered new land. He discovered a place that had lots of new resources and that opened the door for exploration and colonization of the Americas. So he is credited with the discovery of the Americas. However, Columbus never would admit that he had discovered new lands. He maintained that he had reached the West Indies. Now, he did name some of the islands he found and claimed them for Spain, but he didn't think that he'd reached a completely new continent. He thought he had just reached part of the West Indies, and he refused to believe otherwise and maintained that he had reached the West Indies until the day he died, which is why possibly the Americas aren't named after Columbus, but instead after Amerigo Vespucci, who actually claimed he discovered new lands whenever he came to the Americas. So Columbus was the first person to get to the Americas. He just didn't admit that he'd done it. The Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is a statement that was adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776, and it was adopted by the 13 American colonies who formed the Continental Congress. Now, the Declaration of Independence said that King George III of Britain had violated the rights of American colonists. He had put into effect different laws and taxes on the American colonists that seemed unfair to them and took away some of their rights. So the Continental Congress convened to try to come up with a solution. Fighting had already been going on for over a year at the time that this Second Continental Congress occurred, and they decided there wasn't going to be a peaceful way to solve things with Britain. So they declared themselves independent. They said King George had violated the rights of these American colonists, and therefore it announced that the 13 colonies considered themselves as independent states, no longer part of the British Empire. Instead, they said that they formed a new union of those 13 states to be known as the United States of America. So they had tried to work things out peacefully. King George did not take back those laws and taxes. Instead, he fought the American colonists whenever they rebelled against following those laws and paying those taxes. And so after a year of fighting, the Continental Congress met again, and they formed this Declaration of Independence. They declared that they were independent of Britain and that they were their own nation now, to be known as the United States of America. They were no longer part of the British Empire. John Adams was a leader at the Continental Congress, and he pushed for independence. So at first, not everyone was for independence. They thought that was a little radical. They thought maybe they could still make things work with Britain. But after a year of fighting, John Adams was still pushing independence, and it was sounding better to everyone. So on July 2nd, 1776, all 13 colonies unanimously approved this idea to declare themselves independent from Britain. John Adams convinced the committee to allow Thomas Jefferson to write the draft. So Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. Congress edited the draft, and the final version was ratified, which means approved. Everyone agreed to it, and it was ratified by all 13 colonies, or states as they were to be known, on July 4th, 1776. So this date is our date of independence. The day we celebrate as Independence Day was the day that our Declaration of Independence had been edited and everyone signed it and approved it. Everyone who was there from the 13 colonies as representatives at this Continental Congress. Now, Jefferson was influenced by John Locke, who was a 17th century writer, and this was evidenced in his ideas about natural rights. John Locke had written about natural rights, and Jefferson included this in his declaration. Jefferson asserted that people had natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So John Locke had said people have the right to life, liberty, and private property. So Jefferson subbed happiness for private property. While, of course, I'm sure he still meant that people could have private property, he put it in a little bit broader terms. Everyone is entitled to life. Everyone is entitled to liberty, to be free, and everyone is entitled to pursue happiness. And they felt like King George had infringed on some of those natural rights. And so Jefferson was using most of what John Locke had written whenever he wrote life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as natural rights that were being violated in the Declaration of Independence. Now, Jefferson felt and had the Declaration reflect that the purpose of government was to protect the rights of people. Individual rights were more important than the individual's obligations to the state. King George had the opposite idea, and he was trying to force his laws and his taxes on the colonists. So people who were signing the Declaration of Independence were agreeing that people's individual rights were more important than their obligation to the state or to their government. So people's individual rights should come first, and then their obligations to the state. And that is what Jefferson was trying to reflect in the Declaration of Independence. So on July 4th, 1776, all 13 colonies, all representatives from those 13 colonies, to be known as states, ratified the Declaration of Independence, which declared that King George had violated rights of American colonists, and now those 13 colonies were to be known as the United States of America, a separate new nation that was no longer tied to the British Empire. The First and Second Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia on September 5th, 1774. And it was made up of delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies. So this Continental Congress was called when there was a lot of turmoil between the 13 colonies in North America and Britain, who was supposed to be the country that was in charge of these colonies. Now, the colonies weren't cooperating with what Britain wanted them to do, and the colonists felt like they weren't being treated fairly, so they didn't feel any urge to cooperate. However, they didn't want to go to full-scale war with Britain, so they came up with the First Continental Congress. they sent delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies to try to solve this problem. Georgia did not send a delegate because they were having problems on their frontier with Indians and were hoping that Britain would help them with that, and so they didn't want to get involved in the Continental Congress because they were afraid then Britain wouldn't help them, and they had their own issues with the Indians at their borders, Indians being the Native Americans. So, at the first Continental Congress, these 12 delegates had a goal, and their goal was to achieve a peaceful agreement with Britain. They did not want to go to full-scale war with Britain. They knew that Britain was very powerful. They would be outnumbered if they sent a bunch of people over there, and they just basically wanted to get along but not be treated unfairly. So, the Congress affirmed loyalty to Britain and agreed to let Parliament dictate foreign affairs in the colonies. So they said, okay, Britain, we're loyal to you. Parliament can say what goes on with the foreign affairs in the colonies. However, these colonists demanded that the Intolerable Acts be repealed. And the Intolerable Acts were a series of laws or taxes that were enforced, and some of them were taxes on goods that were just unbelievably high and weren't really warranted. Britain was just being greedy and wanting to make more money off of things than they needed to. And some of the other ones were just things that seemed unreasonable. They were forced to quarter British soldiers in their homes, whether they wanted to or not, and this just led to a lot of different things where they felt like their rights were being invaded, and they also didn't have representation back in Britain. There weren't an equal number of colonists over there in Parliament to represent them, so they felt like they shouldn't be paying as much in taxes. So there were a lot of different issues going on there, but the main thing that the colonists wanted was to have these different laws, known as the Intolerable Acts, repealed. And they instituted a trade embargo with Britain until this happened. So they said, okay, we're not trading with Britain anymore. We're not going to buy any more of their stuff. We're not going to ship them any more of our stuff until they repeal the Intolerable Acts. Otherwise, if they did that, we'd be happy to say we're loyal to Britain. Parliament can be in charge of foreign affairs over here in the colonies. That is not what happened. They did not reach their peaceful agreement. King George III of Britain declared the colonies must submit. They must do as Britain was saying, or face military action. So they've been threatened now. We are listening to all this, is what Britain is saying, King George is saying. We don't care that you want to be peaceful, you want this repealed. We're not doing any of that. You listen to us, or there's going to be military action. There will be consequences. So assemblies gathered weapons and formed militias, groups of citizen armies, basically. And these assemblies gathered in all of the colonies. Each colony had an assembly, and it was basically just a group that had collected weapons and sort of formed a militia. The British did not like the assemblies meeting. They didn't want them getting together and making any plans. So they were supposed to break up any assemblies that they wandered onto. And on April 19th, 1775, the British military was ordered to end a meeting of the Massachusetts Assembly. Now, the armed colonists that were in the assembly, because remember, they gathered weapons and had formed militias, the armed colonists resisted the British soldiers, and battles ensued on the Lexington Common. Now, these battles became known as the battles of Lexington and Concord, because that is where the battles between the British military and these armed colonists that were part of the Massachusetts Assembly occurred. And the battles of Lexington and Concord became the first battles of the American Revolution. So the colonists tried to come to a peaceful solution. It didn't work out. King George said, you're going to listen or there's going to be military action. When the colonists resisted and didn't listen, there was military action. Battles ensued, and the battles of Lexington and Concord became the first battles of the American Revolution. So, war has started. Now we come to the Second Continental Congress. Clearly, their solutions that they came up with up here did not work, so the delegates met again. This time, delegates from all 13 colonies came. Georgia was included. Georgia realized, Britain's not helping me with my Indian problem. I need to join with the rest of the colonies. So, delegates from all 13 colonies met in Philadelphia on May 10, 1775, less than a month after Lexington and Concord. So this is April 19th. On May 10th, less than a month after Lexington and Concord, they met. They realized, hey, the British mean business. They're clearly not going to come to a peaceful solution like we wanted. They're not going to repeal the Intolerable Acts. We have to form our own army. We've got to figure out what we're going to do because Britain is definitely going to fight back. So they focused on the defense of the American colonies and local government. Since Britain had been in charge of their government before, they had to come up with their own local government system. So part of what they did was work on local government. Part of what they did was talk about their defense. What were they going to do? So the delegates also discussed declaring independence from Britain. And this was a drastic thing because Britain was controlling all of them. But they said, you know what? We can declare ourselves independent from Britain. They're fighting us. They don't want to do what we want. It's hard to get across that whole big ocean to be over there and actually be represented in Parliament. Why not just have our own separate country over here? And many delegates were in favor of this option. So they established an army and named George Washington commander-in-chief. Now at this point, they did not decide to declare independence. They discussed declaring independence from Britain. Many were in favor, but they hadn't declared it yet. They did establish an army and make George Washington commander-in-chief. They did discuss the defense of the American colonies, which resulted in this army, and they set up a provisional local government, an idea for how that was going to be run. However, by 1776, the delegates realized there was no turning back from full-scale war with Britain, and after this was over, there was no way they were going to patch things up. So they drafted the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. So your First Continental Congress was about trying to find a peaceful solution with Britain. The Second Continental Congress decided there can't be a peaceful solution. Britain's definitely going to fight us and is not going to give in. So they decided to form their own army. They chose a leader, and eventually they drafted the Declaration of Independence to declare themselves independent of Britain. The Lewis and Clark Expedition. The purchase of the Louisiana Territory in 1803 more than doubled the size of the United States. President Thomas Jefferson wanted to have this newly acquired land mapped and explored since most of the territory was considered wilderness. It was unexplored, nobody knew what was out there. They knew Native Americans were there, but it hadn't been mapped out and no one had laid claim to it out past the Louisiana Territory. Everything in the Louisiana Territory had just been purchased from France, so the United States did own it, but they didn't know what was out there. So Thomas Jefferson wanted to have an expedition sent out there to explore it, map it out, let everyone know what was out there. Jefferson wanted to ensure America's claim on the land. He felt like if he didn't get out there soon enough with Americans and start settling the land, laying a claim to it, proving that it was their land, other nations like Britain or other European countries would come in and say that they were staking claims on certain parts of the land. So Jefferson wanted to get out there quickly. He chose Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to head an expedition into the territory. The expedition included 33 people, and all but one of them made it back. The only one who didn't make it back died of appendicitis. He did not die from anything on the expedition. They traveled from May 1804 to September 1806. So you see they acquired the territory in 1803, and very quickly in 1804, Jefferson was sending an expedition out to start mapping this territory. And you can see it lasted a little over 2 years. It took them that long to travel across the Louisiana Territory and come back to where there were known American settlements. They were searching for a water route that would connect the Missouri River with the Pacific Ocean. And this was for commerce. If they could reach the Pacific Ocean and they could reach potential new settlements along the river, then it would be easier to transport goods back and forth. So Jefferson wanted to know if this was a possibility, so Lewis and Clark were looking for a continuous water route. Though the expedition did make it all the way to the Pacific Ocean, they did not discover a continuous water route. So they could go a lot of the way on rivers, but there were the Rocky Mountains in the way and some other areas that cut off one water source from the next. So they weren't able to travel continually by water, but they did travel all the way from known American settlements up the Missouri River and some other rivers and then across land until they reached the Pacific Ocean. And they've gone further with mapping than any other Americans had gone. The expedition did draw a variety of maps. They recorded their encounters in detailed journals. And the expedition provided knowledge about the land they had traversed as well as the plants, animals, and people that resided there. So while they didn't discover that continuous water route they were looking for, they were able to bring back a lot from their 2-year expedition. They brought maps, they brought detailed journals that were going to help future expeditions and travelers whenever they started heading out that way, and knowledge about plants, animals, and the people, the Native Americans that lived there. So they drew about 140 maps during their 2-year expedition. They noted over 70 native tribes that were along their route, and they recorded more than 200 new plant and animal species. So, while they didn't do everything they set out to do with finding that continuous water route, they did accomplish a lot. They drew these maps, they noted over 70 native tribes, they discovered lots of new plants and animals that had not been found in America before. And the Lewis and Clark expedition made a clear claim for America in the West, in the Louisiana Territory, and beyond, opening it all up for future expedition, future exploration, and settlement. So Jefferson did accomplish what he wanted to with putting a clear American claim on the land. The Missouri Compromise. In 1820, the territory called Missouri asked to enter the Union as a slave state. This would have made the number of slave states 12 compared to 11 free states. So at this time in the United States, a state was considered either a free state or a slave state. If the state allowed slavery, it was a slave state. If the state did not allow slavery, then it was a free state. So most of your free states were going to be up north, and most of your slave states are going to be down in the south because slavery was more prevalent in the south. Now, in 1820, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states, so there were an even number for each side of this issue. So if Missouri had entered as another slave state, this would have given the slave states the upper hand when it came to voting for different things in Congress. There would be more people in favor of slavery than there were in favor of not having slavery, in favor of being a free state. So, rather than allow this to happen, James Talmadge proposed abolishing slavery in Missouri. So he said, okay, how about we just make Missouri a free state? If we make Missouri abolish slavery, Missouri enters as a free state, how about that? Well, that wouldn't have been a great solution for everyone because then there would have been 12 free states and only 11 slave states, so someone's still getting slighted there. So Henry Clay then offered another solution known as the Missouri Compromise. According to this proposal, Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state, but Maine would separate from Massachusetts and become a free state. So Massachusetts was already a free state. Maine at this time was part of Massachusetts. So in Henry Clay's compromise, Maine separated and became its own state, and it would enter as a free state. Missouri would enter as a slave state as it wanted, and that would change the number of both free states and slave states to 12. You'd have one of each being added, and so that was the compromise. It kept the number even. Each group would have the same number of states on the issue of slavery. But Missouri could still enter as a slave state as it had wanted to. Furthermore, everything south of Missouri would be slave territory, and everything above would be free. So the Missouri Compromise also lined out something for the future. In the future, anything south of Missouri would be considered slave territory, so if a state was to enter the Union from that area, it would be considered a slave state, and anything above Missouri would be free. So any states entering from above Missouri, any new states entering the Union would be free states. And this pretty much set a precedent as states were added that there would generally be one slave state added for one free state. They wouldn't allow just one or the other to join, because then that would upset the balance in Congress. So they wanted to keep things even, and the Missouri Compromise kind of set the stage for that. Now, this compromise was satisfactory to pretty much everybody for several reasons, even though the proposed free lands were larger than slave lands. So you might think some would have a problem with this, especially because the proposed free lands north of Missouri were larger than the slave lands south of Missouri. But people had their reasons for being okay with this compromise. This was because most agreed that slavery could not be successful in colder climates. So if you move up north, it gets colder. And people thought, you know what, slavery's not going to be that successful up north anyway, so it's okay if everything north of Missouri is going to be a free state, because slavery wouldn't work there very well anyway. Most of the slaves are working on large plantations. Large plantations aren't going to be able to grow for as many months out of the year further north where it's colder. So this wasn't really something that was going to work as well up north, so they were fine with that area being free. Additionally, many thought that Texas would soon be a part of the United States. Texas was a very large area of land, and it would mostly be south of Missouri. So people thought, okay, Texas will join the Union soon, and then we'll have all that land in an additional state or multiple states that will be considered slave states, more slave territory. So everyone was okay with this because slavery wasn't going to work as well up north anyway, and the South thought, okay, we'll be getting more land soon anyway, so it doesn't matter if right now the free lands are larger than the slave lands. So the Missouri Compromise was a solution that Henry Clay came up with in response to Missouri's request to join the Union as a slave state, which would have offset the balance and made the United States have 12 slave states to 11 free states. The compromise included Missouri getting to enter as a slave state at the same time that Maine separated from Massachusetts and became a free state. And it also clarified for the future that anything south of Missouri would be slave territory and anything north of Missouri would be free territory.
The U.S. federal government affects all of our lives. It is made up of 3 different branches. The branches were established by the U.S. Constitution, which was adopted in 1787. The first branch serves in the Capitol building, the U.S. Capitol building, and it's the legislative branch. Now, there are 2 parts to the legislative branch. There's the Senate, which is made up of 100 members, 2 from each state, and there's the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is made up of 435 members. So all told, there are 535 members of the legislative branch. And these are designated based on census numbers to each state. And so a state like California has a lot more representatives than a state like Delaware. The second branch is the White House, and this is the White House, and it's the executive branch. The executive branch includes the president, and you have the vice president and the cabinet. There are 15 different cabinet positions ranging from the Secretary of State, which is the oldest, most prestigious of the cabinet offices, and all the way to the Department of Homeland Security, which is a more recent creation. The third branch of the government is the judiciary, which is housed in the Supreme Court, which is the top court of the land. Now, the Supreme Court, underneath them, there's the Court of Appeals, and underneath those are district courts. And very few cases actually make it all the way up to the Supreme Court. Most cases are heard at the district courts, and then if one of the sides appeals, it may be heard by the Court of Appeals, and then the Supreme Court is the final arbitrator in any lawsuit that is filed. And so these are the three different branches of government, and they all have different powers, and the Constitution was structured this way so that there are checks and balances between each of them, and they each have a different function. The legislative function is to make laws. And that's why we hear about different congressmen or senators that may be arguing over which laws we should have. The executive branch, they enforce the laws. And the Supreme Court and our court system, they oversee the laws and decide which ones are constitutional and which are not, and so they evaluate them. They evaluate the laws. And they can determine if a law should be considered unconstitutional and removed from the books. And so these three branches of government make up the U.S. federal government, and we should know how they are structured and the different divisions of them.
In this video, we want to go over prefixes. Prefixes are short little sections of words that come before the root of a word and help you understand what the word means. They add an extra nuance to the word. And why prefixes and suffixes, for that matter, are important, prefixes coming before the root of the word, suffixes, short little endings after the word, is that if you know your basic prefixes and suffixes, they help you determine the meaning of a word. And they're important clues, especially if you're taking a standardized test where they say we want you to find the word with the opposite meaning. Sometimes just knowing the prefix can give you enough of a clue, even if you don't know what the root means, to find the opposite. We've got a few examples on the board, and we want to go through those briefly just to show you the importance of prefixes, how they can help you in your test-taking strategies, and how they can help you understand the meanings of words. So prefixes give clues as to a word's meaning. Knowing them can help you find the word with the opposite meaning on a test. So words like prefixes like pre. Here we think pre-operative, pre-op. That means before the operation. Or prescient. Pre meaning before, and scient from the word science, which means knowledge. So to know ahead of time. So prescient is to know ahead of time. Pre-game show, the part that comes before the game. So pre means before. The opposite of pre is post. Post-operative care, the care that happens after the operation. Post-game show, the show that happens after the game. So pre is before, post is after. If you realize this opposites, then if you see a word that's got a pre prefix on it, then you look for a word with a post prefix on it if the test is asking you to find the opposite. Another thing would be pro and d. So pro means for, as in pro-life. Someone who is pro-life is for life. DE is the negation, so deconstruction. To deconstruct is the opposite of, or the negation of construction. Construction to build up, deconstruct to destroy. So pro meaning for, de is usually a negation, pre before, post after. Knowing your prefixes can be critical, especially if you're not sure of the whole word. You can say, well, let me break this word up into its prefix, its root, and its suffix, and see if I can't decode just from that minimal information the proper answer on the other side. Now, obviously, when you're taking a test, if you know the right answer, you always go with the right answer. But if you're struggling, if you're not sure, this is a strategy you can use. You can look at the word, break it down, and say, here's the prefix, and I know it means this, and I'm being asked to find the opposite. What's the opposite of this prefix? Then I've got my answer, more than likely. Caution, though. Caution. Con and pro are opposites, but congress is not the opposite of progress, although some people might disagree. That's more of a joke in terms of Congress being the opposite of progress, but con and pro are opposites, but you have to know and be careful sometimes. Anyway, that's been just a basic introduction and overview of the importance of prefixes as a test-taking strategy of knowing what they mean to help you determine the meaning of a word, and also to assist you if you're being asked to look for the opposite. If you know what the prefix means and you know what the opposite of that prefix is, it makes it a snap to find the right answer. If you'd like to learn more about this or related matters, underneath this video you'll see a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website that has that information. While you're on that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
Characters are an essential part of every story. So characters can be classified into two main categories, flat and round. The terms flat and round pertain to how much the character changes throughout the story. So flat characters have little change in personality throughout the story, or many times no change in personality. They're very predictable, they're always the same. And because they're predictable, they can be considered not very interesting. So that's why they play small roles in the story. The main characters of a story are never going to be flat characters. Instead, they're going to be round characters, because round characters incur lots of change throughout the course of a story. So they play the main roles. So flat characters and round characters both contribute a lot to a story. Obviously, round characters are needed to play the main roles because they're going to be developing and changing a lot, and that's what moves the plot along. The plot is moved along by changes in characters' personalities. Flat characters are also needed, however, because they play the smaller roles in the story, the supporting roles that make the main characters very interesting. So when we're talking about round characters, you probably heard me use the word development. And that's what authors try to do with round characters. They try to develop the characters, and it's the development of the characters that moves the plot along. If the characters stay the same, throughout the entire story, then the plot's not very interesting because the plot's not going to progress very much. So round characters are essential to moving the plot along. But the important thing to take away from this, if you remember one thing, is that characters can be split up into flat characters and round characters. Flat characters having the same personality and round characters changing in personality throughout the story.
Theme. Theme is the overall idea of a piece of literature. So think about the lesson or moral of the story that the author is trying to get across to you. One thing to remember is do not confuse theme with plot. Plot is what the characters do. It's the action of the story. It does not have to do with the overall lesson or message that the author is getting across. Now, obviously, what the characters do is going to help you understand the theme, but plot and theme are not the same thing. Plot is going to be more about human nature, society, and life in general. There can also be more than one theme. The author may have one overall message, but there may be a few messages in there, or you may be able to find more than one theme besides the main controlling theme of the story. Some questions to ask yourself are, what is the lesson or message? And some common themes are, man struggles against society, man struggles against nature, overcoming adversity, the importance of family and friendship, man struggles with faith, sacrifices bring rewards, and honesty is the best policy. So for all of these, I want us to look at the story of the tortoise and the hare from Aesop's Fables. And this shows you that there can definitely be more than one theme for one story. Now, all of these may not be what Aesop had in mind when he was coming up with this fable, but I was able to see all of these themes in the story. The last one, I couldn't come up with something for, but I've got a good one for that as well. So, man struggles against society. You've got this tortoise who feels like he's going to keep going and he's going to try to win the race, but all of society is against him and saying, oh, that hare has got you beat. He's way faster than you. I don't know why you think you're fast enough to beat him. So I'm sure that tortoise was struggling against society's views of him. Another one would be man struggle against nature. The tortoise is struggling against the nature of his self, how he's made. He's obviously not going to be as fast as the hare. He's going to have to go up hills. He's going to be fighting against the very nature of his self, where the hare is made to go much faster. Overcoming adversity. Just simply winning the race, the tortoise ended up winning even though no one expected him to do it. Even though people were probably telling him, oh, you can't do that. The hare's always going to beat you. The importance of family and friendship. Now, I've talked a lot about society, telling the tortoise he couldn't do this, but I'd like to think that the tortoise had some family and friends on his side that were urging him on, that helped him feel like he could actually go through and win this race. Man struggles with faith. The tortoise had to have faith in himself. The hare was very, very cocky. He felt like he had this race won, so much so that he went and took a nap, where the tortoise didn't do that. He had faith in himself and knew that he could do this if he just kept going, if he gave it his all. And then sacrifices bring rewards. The tortoise sacrificed that nap that the hare took, and in the end he won the race because he just kept going. Now, the moral of the story they give you is slow and steady wins the race, but I can see all of these themes in that story. Now, honesty is the best policy. I couldn't really come up with one for, but you can always look at Pinocchio. Pinocchio, every time he told a lie, his nose grew. It was not a good thing. Every time he lied, something bad happened to him. I won't ruin the whole story for you, but everyone knows about the growing nose, which is a sad punishment for someone who is not using honesty. So it's showing you honesty is the best policy. So whenever you're reading a story, you can look at what the characters are doing to figure out what the plot is, but remember the theme is different. The theme is going to be the controlling idea in that piece of literature. And you want to ask yourself, what is the lesson or moral the author is trying to get across to me? Context. Sometimes when you're reading and you come across a word that you don't know, you can use context clues to make an educated guess as to what the word means. Now, when you're looking at the word you don't know, you don't want to just look right before and after the word. You usually want to look at the sentence before and the sentence after. And sometimes you even have to look at the whole paragraph to get an idea of what that unfamiliar word means. Now, there are some clues that we can look at to help determine what the word means. One thing you can look at is a description. Sometimes a sentence or a sentence following or before the unfamiliar word will give you a description. For instance, the green-feathered macaw. Well, you may not know the word macaw, but by seeing green-feathered, you can infer that it is some kind of a bird with green feathers. Another clue you can look at are synonyms. if you hear the soft and supple leather. Well, since you have soft here and then supple, both describing leather, you can figure out that supple probably has something to do with being soft. And in reality, it means moldable. It's easily moldable, and it is somewhat soft to be able to do that. We'll go ahead and note that this one was our bird. Now another clue you can look for are antonyms. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have a malevolent bone in her body. Well, you may not know what malevolent means, but you probably know what sweet means. And if she isn't malevolent and she is sweet, then you can figure out malevolent is something bad, something negative, the opposite of sweet. And in reality, malevolent means evil. Another clue you can look for are definitions. Sometimes the sentence before, after, or part of the same sentence your word is in will just give you the definition of the word. For instance, the echidna, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then they might tell you some interesting fact about the echidna. Well, in commas, right after echidna is the definition of an echidna, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia. So you know what it is right there. The last clue you can look for is tone. Is the rest of this paragraph positive, negative, happy, scared? If you have a paragraph that's all one tone, then the word probably has something to do with that. If it's a scary tone, then this may be a word that it has to do with something scary. If it's positive, it may be a happy kind of word. So you can always take that into consideration whenever you are taking your educated guess. So once you've looked at clues and you've tried to figure out, looking before and after the sentence your word is in, looking at the whole paragraph, seeing if you can find a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or figure out the tone surrounding that unfamiliar word, you want to take a guess as to what the word means. And then you want to reread the sentence to see if it makes sense to you and ask yourself, does it make sense? So if we were to insert bird here, the green feathered bird. Well, if it's something that has feathers and we have bird after it, that makes sense, so that one would work. The soft and supple leather. So if we know it means something else soft, maybe moldable, we could say the soft and moldable leather, the soft and flexible leather. Any kind of word like that that you put in that was similar to soft would work. It would make sense in your sentence. Okay? We were thinking evil here, something the opposite of sweet. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone in her body. That makes sense. She is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone. Now, the echidna sentence is a little different. If they plug in a definition for you, then it's a little harder to check. You would just say an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then maybe tell the sentence after that point, because the definition's already there for you. There's not really a synonym for echidna or anything else you could have come up with for what that one meant. And once you've checked to make sure they all make sense, then you have a pretty good idea of what that word means. And you can see how using these context clues of looking for a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or the tone of a paragraph can help you figure out that pesky, unfamiliar word. Figurative language. Figurative language is language that goes beyond the literal meaning of a word, and authors will use figurative language to enhance their writing. Some common examples of figurative language are hyperbole, simile, metaphor, and personification. So we'll discuss each of those, and I'll give you some examples for each. Hyperbole is exaggeration. People will say something and you aren't meant to take it literally. You're meant to know it's an exaggeration, but it's there just to emphasize how strongly the author is trying to convey something. For instance, I've told you 1,000,000 times. I bet some of you have probably heard that one. And 1,000,000 times, really? Probably you haven't heard whatever your parent or teacher has said they've told you 1,000,000 times. It's an exaggeration. It's hyperbole. It's meant to emphasize that they've already told you this a lot more times before now. Another example would be, I had a ton of homework. You did not literally go home with 2,000 pounds of homework, but you're telling people I had a lot of homework. It was way more than the normal amount. It was a ton. It was that much homework. So that's what hyperbole is, exaggeration. Next we've got simile, which is comparing two things using like or as. And this is very important. You have to use those words like or as, or it's not going to be a simile anymore. So, the child howled like a coyote. We see our word like. You're comparing two things in this sentence. The child howled like a coyote compares the child to a coyote using the word like. This example is letting you know that the child is loud. Its crying sounds like a howl, much like a coyote. So this figurative language is used to bring a coyote to mind to help you picture and hear in your mind how this child is screaming or crying. Next, let's look at this example. She ran as fast as lightning. Well, that's going to compare two things here, and we see the word as. So what is being compared in this sentence? She ran as fast as lightning. And usually when you have one as, you've got two. So it's comparing she, or a girl, to lightning. And that is being done by using the word as. So when you're comparing a girl to lightning, you're saying she's that fast. It went so fast you barely got to see her before she got past you or got to the finish line. So it's just letting you know she's really, really fast. So that's what simile is, comparing two things using like or as. And again, these are the important words to look for to make it actually be a simile. It could be a metaphor, which compares two things without using like or as. And that is really the big difference between a simile and a metaphor. A simile uses like or as. A metaphor does not use like or as. So let's look at some metaphor examples. She was lightning running down the track. So this sentence is very similar to this one. They're both comparing she, or a girl, to lightning. They're both saying this girl is really fast, but this one just says she was lightning. She was lightning running down the track. It doesn't say she ran as fast as lightning. It doesn't use like or as, it just says she was lightning. So it's a different way to use the same kind of figurative language. So that's one example of a metaphor. Let's look at this. And this is an excerpt from Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. Now this one's a little trickier because it doesn't just come out and say this was this or this is this. Like here it said she was lightning. But it says that his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. So we're comparing his eyes to a demon's eyes, which is basically comparing him, or a man, to a demon. If his eyes are like a demon's eyes, then this man is being compared to a demon, which is to maybe say that the man is evil. It doesn't mean he's literally a demon. It means he's got some characteristic of a demon. He's maybe an evil person. So in poetry, your figurative language may not always pop out at you if it's a metaphor. A simile is pretty easy to spot because you'll see like or as. But a metaphor might be a little trickier. So just look for what two things are being compared in that sentence or that phrase of a poem. And the last piece of figurative language we're going to discuss is personification, which is when an inanimate object is given human qualities. You are personifying it. You are making it do something a person would do, even though it's not something that can do these things. And remember, inanimate objects are going to be things that are not alive. A chair, a teapot, the wind, water, those are inanimate objects. So the example here, the water slapped the side of the boat. The water slapped. Can water actually slap like a person would slap? No, but it makes you think of the action of slapping and the sound you might hear with the slap whenever you picture this water slapping the side of the boat. And that's why they're using this particular word and personifying the water. Depending on what the story is about where this sentence appears, it could be that the water is being made as like an evil character. If someone drowns in this story, then the water would be seen as an enemy, and so it slapping the side of the boat would give it that negative feeling. Another example, the teapot shrieked. Shrieking, screaming, that loud sound, you can hear it in your head when you think about the noise a teapot makes. But a teapot isn't actually shrieking like a person would. It's simply making that noise because the air is hot enough that it's trying to get out now. Or the wind howled. Wind can't howl like a wolf would howl, but wind makes that same kind of sound sometimes, and so the author is trying to put that sound of howling in your mind when they're describing the wind. So figurative language can be a lot of different things. Hyperbole, where you're exaggerating. Simile, where you're comparing two things using like or as. Very important markers for a simile. Metaphor, where you're comparing two things without using like or as. And personification, when an object is given human qualities, whenever it's personified. And all of these techniques are used so that the words will go beyond the literal meaning of them and give you a deeper understanding of the poem or the work that you're reading. The author is trying to go beyond the words and make you really think about their meaning and put certain connotations in your head whenever you're reading.